The Peterloo Massacre occurred at St. Peter's Field, Manchester, England, on 16 August 1819, when cavalry charged into a crowd of 60,000–80,000 that had gathered to demand the reform of parliamentary representation. The end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815 had resulted in periods of famine and chronic unemployment, exacerbated by the introduction of the first of the Corn Laws. By the beginning of 1819, the pressure generated by poor economic conditions, coupled with the relative lack of suffrage in northern England, had enhanced the appeal of political radicalism. In response, the Manchester Patriotic Union, a group agitating for parliamentary reform, organised a demonstration to be addressed by the well-known radical orator Henry Hunt. Shortly after the meeting began, local magistrates called on the military authorities to arrest Hunt and several others on the hustings with him, and to disperse the crowd. Cavalry charged into the crowd with sabres drawn, and in the ensuing confusion, 15 people were killed and 400 to 700 were injured. The massacre was given the name Peterloo in an ironic comparison to the Battle of Waterloo, which had taken place 4 years earlier. Historian Robert Poole has called the Peterloo Massacre one of the defining moments of its age. In its own time, the London and national papers shared the horror felt in the Manchester region. But Peterloo's immediate effect was to cause the government to crack down on reform, with the passing of what became known as the Six Acts. It also led directly to the foundation of the Manchester Guardian, but had little other effect on the pace of reform. In a survey conducted by the Guardian in 2006, Peterloo came second to the Putney debates as the event from radical British history that most deserved a proper monument or a memorial. Peterloo is commemorated by a plaque close to the site, a replacement for an earlier one that was criticised as being inadequate as it did not reflect the scale of the massacre. Background: suffrage. In 1819, Lancashire was represented by 2 members of Parliament. Voting was restricted to the adult male owners of freehold land with an annual rental value of 40 shillings or more, the equivalent of about £80 in 2008, and votes could only be cast at the county town of Lancaster, by a public spoken declaration at the hustings. Constituency boundaries were out of date, and the so-called rotten boroughs had a hugely disproportionate influence on the membership of the Parliament of the United Kingdom compared to the size of their populations. Old Sarum in Wiltshire, with 1 voter, elected 2 MPs, as did Dunwich in Suffolk, which by the early 19th century had almost completely disappeared into the sea. The major urban centres of Manchester, Salford, Bolton, Blackburn, Rochdale, Ashton-under-Lyne, Oldham and Stockport, with a combined population of almost 1 million, were represented by either the 2 county MPs for Lancashire, or the 2 for Cheshire in the case of Stockport. By comparison, more than half of all MPs were returned by a total of just 154 owners of rotten or closed boroughs. In 1816, Thomas Oldfield's The Representative History of Great Britain and Ireland, being a history of the House of Commons, and of the counties, cities, and boroughs of the United Kingdom from the earliest period, claimed that of the 515 MPs for England and Wales, 351 were returned by the patronage of 177 individuals and a further 16 by the direct patronage of the government. All 45 Scottish MPs owed their seats to patronage. These inequalities in political representation led to calls for reform. Economic conditions. After the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815, a brief boom in textile manufacture was followed by periods of chronic economic depression, particularly among textile weavers and spinners. Weavers who could have expected to earn 15 shillings for a 6-day week in 1803, saw their wages cut to 5 shillings or even 4s60 by 1818. The industrialists, who were cutting wages without offering relief, blamed market forces generated by the aftershocks of the Napoleonic Wars. Exacerbating matters were the Corn Laws, the first of which was passed in 1815, imposing a tariff on foreign grain in an effort to protect English grain producers. The cost of food rose as people were forced to buy the more expensive and lower-quality British grain, and periods of famine and chronic unemployment ensued, increasing the desire for political reform both in Lancashire and in the country at large. Radical mass meetings in Manchester. Economic conditions in 1817 led to a group who became known as Blanketeers to organise a march from Manchester to London so they could petition the Prince Regent for parliamentary reform. A crowd of 25,000, including 5,000 men who intended to march, gathered in St. Peter's Fields. After the magistrates read the Riot Act, the crowd was dispersed by the King's Dragoon Guards. The ringleaders were arrested and subsequently released when serious charges against him were not forthcoming. In April 1819, 3 leading Blanketeers were convicted of sedition and conspiracy when witnesses alleged they had advocated the principal towns of the kingdom should elect representatives to a national convention to demand their rights and if refused enforce them, sword in hand, during a meeting in Stockport in September 1818. By the beginning of 1819, pressure generated by poor economic conditions was at its peak and had enhanced the appeal of political radicalism among the cotton loom weavers of South Lancashire. In January 1819, a crowd of about 10,000 gathered at St. Peter's Fields to hear the radical orator Henry Hunt and called on the Prince Regent to choose ministers who would repeal the Corn Laws. The meeting, conducted in the presence of the cavalry, passed off without incident. In July 1819, the town's magistrates wrote to Lord Sidmouth warning they thought a general rising was imminent. The deep distress of the manufacturing classes was being worked on by the unbounded liberty of the press, and the harangues of a few desperate demagogues at weekly meetings. Possessing no power to prevent the meetings, the magistrates admitted they were at a loss as to how to stem the doctrines being disseminated. August meeting. Against this background, a great assembly was organised by the Manchester Patriotic Union, formed by radicals from the Manchester Observer. The newspaper's founder Joseph Johnson was the union's secretary. He wrote to Henry Hunt asking him to chair a meeting in Manchester on the 2nd of August 1819. Johnson wrote, "Nothing but ruin and starvation stare one in the face, in the streets of Manchester and the surrounding towns. The state of this district is truly dreadful, and I believe nothing but the greatest exertions can prevent an insurrection. Oh, that you in London were prepared for it." Unknown to Johnson and Hunt, the letter was intercepted by government spies and copied before being sent to its destination. The contents were interpreted to mean that an insurrection was being planned, and the government responded by ordering the 15th Hussars to Manchester. The mass public meeting planned for the 2nd of August was delayed until the 9th of August. The Manchester Observer reported it was called to take into consideration the most speedy and effectual mode of obtaining radical reform in the Common House of Parliament, and to consider the propriety of the unrepresented inhabitants of Manchester electing a person to represent him in Parliament. The magistrates, led by William Hurlton, had been advised by the acting Home Secretary, Henry Hobhouse, that the election of a Member of Parliament without the King's writ was a serious misdemeanour, encouraging them to declare the Assembly illegal as soon as it was announced on the 31st of July. The Radicals sought a second opinion on the meeting's legality, which was that the intention of choosing representatives contrary to the existing law tends greatly to render the proposed meeting seditious. Under those circumstances it would be deemed justifiable in the magistrates to prevent such meeting. On the 3rd of August, Hobhouse conveyed the view of the Attorney General that the magistrates were incorrect to declare the 9th of August meeting illegal, as it was called to consider the election of a representative, and it was not the intention to elect an MP that was illegal, but the execution of that intention. On the 4th of August, Hobhouse advised against any attempt to forcibly prevent the 9th of August meeting if it went ahead, or do anything beyond collecting evidence for subsequent prosecution unless the meeting got out of hand. Even if they should utter sedition or proceed to the election of a representative, Lord Sidmouth is of opinion that it will be the wisest course to abstain from any endeavour to disperse the mob, unless they should proceed to acts of felony or riot. We have the strongest reason to believe that Hunt means to preside and to deprecate disorder. The meeting on the 9th of August was postponed after magistrates banned it to discourage the radicals, but Hunt and his followers were determined to assemble, and a meeting was organized for the 16th of August, with its declared aim solely to consider the propriety of adopting the most legal and effectual means of obtaining a reform in the Common House of Parliament. The press had mocked earlier meetings of working men because of their ragged, dirty appearance and disorganized conduct, but the organizers were determined that those attending the St. Peter's Field meeting would be neatly turned out and marched to the event in good order. Samuel Bamford, a local radical who led the Middleton contingent, wrote that it was deemed expedient that this meeting should be as morally effective as possible, and that it should exhibit a spectacle such as had never before been witnessed in England. Instructions were given to the various committees forming the contingents that cleanliness, sobriety, order and peace, and a prohibition of all weapons of offence or defence were to be observed throughout the demonstration. Each contingent was drilled and rehearsed in the fields of the townships around Manchester, adding to the concerns of the authorities. A royal proclamation forbidding the practice of drilling had been posted in Manchester on the 3rd of August, but on the 9th of August an informant reported to Rochdale magistrates that at Tandle Hill the previous day, 700 men were drilling in companies, and going through the usual evolutions of a regiment, and an onlooker had said the men were fit to contend with any regular troops, only they wanted arms. Assembly preparations. St. Peter's Field was a croft alongside Mount Street which was being cleared to enable the last section of Peter Street to be constructed. Piles of brushwood had been placed at the end of the field nearest to the Friends Meeting House, but the remainder of the field was clear. Thomas Worrell, Manchester's assistant surveyor of paving, arrived to inspect the field at 7 a.m. His job was to remove anything that might be used as a weapon, and he duly had about a quarter of a load of stones carted away. Monday the 16th of August 1819, was a hot summer's day, with a cloudless blue sky. The fine weather almost certainly increased the size of the crowd significantly. Marching from the outer townships in the cold and rain would have been a much less attractive prospect. The Manchester magistrates met at 9 a.m. to breakfast at the Star Inn on Deansgate and to consider what action they should take on Henry Hunt's arrival at the meeting. By 10:30 a.m. they had come to no conclusions, and moved to a house on the southeastern corner of St. Peter's Field, from where they planned to observe the meeting. They were concerned that it would end in a riot, or even a rebellion, and had arranged for a substantial number of regular troops and militia yeomanry to be deployed. The military presence comprised 600 men of the 15th Hussars, several hundred infantrymen, a Royal Horse Artillery unit with 2 6-pounder guns, 400 men of the Cheshire Yeomanry, 400 special constables, and 120 cavalry of the Manchester and Salford Yeomanry. The Manchester and Salford Yeomanry were relatively inexperienced militia recruited from among local shopkeepers and tradesmen, the most numerous of which were publicans. recently mocked by the Manchester Observer as, generally speaking, the fawning dependence of the great, with a few fools and a greater proportion of coxcombs, who imagine they acquire considerable importance by wearing regimentals. They were subsequently variously described as younger members of the Tory party in arms, and as hot-headed young men who had volunteered into that service from their intense hatred of radicalism. Socialist writer Mark Krantz has described them as the local business mafia on horseback. The British Army in the north was under the overall command of General Sir John Byng. When he had initially learned that the meeting was scheduled for the 2nd of August, he wrote to the Home Office stating that he hoped the Manchester magistrates would show firmness on the day. "I will be prepared to go there, and will have in that neighbourhood, that is within an easy day's march, 8 squadron of cavalry, 18 companies of infantry and the guns. I am sure I can add to the yeomanry if requisite. I hope therefore the civil authorities will not be deterred from doing their duty." The revised meeting date of the 16th of August, however, coincided with his visit to the horse races at York, a fashionable event at which Byng had entries in 2 races. He once again wrote to the Home Office, saying that although he would still be prepared to be in command in Manchester on the day of the meeting if it was thought really necessary, he had absolute confidence in his deputy commander, Lieutenant Colonel Guy Lestrange. Meeting the crowd that gathered in St. Peter's Field arrived in discipline and organized contingents. Each village or chapelry was given a time and a place to meet, from where its members were to proceed to assembly points in the larger towns or townships, and from there on to Manchester. Contingents were sent from all around the region, the largest and best dressed of which was a group of 10,000 who had travelled from Oldham Green, comprising people from Oldham, Royton, Crompton, Lees, Saddleworth and Mossley. Other sizable contingents marched from Middleton and Rochdale and Stockport. Reports of the size of the crowd at the meeting vary substantially. Contemporaries estimated it from 30,000 to as many as 150,000. Modern estimates are 60,000–80,000. Scholar Joyce Marlowe describes the event as the most numerous meeting that ever took place in Great Britain, and elaborates that the generally accepted figure of 60,000 would have been 6% of the population of Lancashire, or half the population of the immediate area around Manchester. The assembly was intended by its organisers and participants to be a peaceful meeting. Henry Hunt had exhorted everyone attending to come armed with no other weapon but that of a self-approving conscience, and many were wearing their Sunday best clothes. Samuel Bamford recounts the following incident, which occurred as the Middleton contingent reached the outskirts of Manchester. On the bank of an open field on our left I perceived a gentleman observing us attentively. He beckoned me, and I went to him. He was one of my late employers. He took my hand, and rather concernedly, but kindly, said he hoped no harm was intended by all those people who were coming in. I said I would pledge my life for their entire peaceableness. I asked him to notice them. Did they look like persons wishing to outrage the law? Were they not, on the contrary, evidently heads of decent working families? All members of such families? No, no, I said, my dear sir, and old respected master, if any wrong or violence take place, they will be committed by men of a different stamp from these. He said he was very glad to hear me say so. He was happy he had seen me, and gratified by the manner in which I had expressed myself. I asked, did he think we should be interrupted at the meeting? He said he did not believe we should. Then, I replied, all will be well, and shaking hands, with mutual good wishes, I left him, and took my station as before. Although some observers, like the Rev. W.R. Hay, chairman of the Salford Quarter Sessions, claimed that the active part of the meeting may be said to have come in wholly from the country. Others, such as John Shuttleworth, a local cotton manufacturer, estimated that most were from Manchester, a view that would subsequently be supported by the casualty lists. Of the casualties whose residence was recorded, 61% lived within a 3-mile radius of the centre of Manchester. Some groups carried banners with texts like "No Corn Laws," "Annual Parliaments," "Universal Suffrage," and "Vote by Ballot." The first female reform societies were established in the textile areas in 1819, and women from the Manchester Female Reform Society, dressed in white, accompanied Hunt to the platform. The society's president Mary Fields rode in Hunt's carriage carrying its flag. The only banner known to have survived is in Middleton Public Library. It was carried by Thomas Redford, who was injured by a yeomanry sabre, made of green silk embossed with gold lettering. One side of the banner is inscribed, "Liberty and Fraternity," and the other, "Unity and Strength." At about noon, several hundred special constables were led onto the field. They formed two lines in the crowd a few yards apart, in an attempt to form a corridor through the crowd between the house where the magistrates were watching and the hustings. Two wagons lashed together, believing that this might be intended as the route by which the magistrates would later send their representatives to arrest the speakers. Some members of the crowd pushed the wagons away from the constables, and pressed around the hustings to form a human barrier. Hunt's carriage arrived at the meeting shortly after 1 p.m., and he made his way to the hustings. Alongside Hunt on the speaker's stand were John Knight, a cotton manufacturer and reformer; Joseph Johnson, the organizer of the meeting; John Thacker Saxton, managing editor of the Manchester Observer; the publisher Richard Carlile; and George Swift, reformer and shoemaker. There were also a number of reporters, including John Tyers of the Times, John Smith of the Liverpool Echo, and Edward Baines Jr., the son of the editor of the Leeds Mercury. By this time St. Peter's Field, an area of 14,000 square yards, was packed with tens of thousands of men, women and children. The crowd around the speakers was so dense that their hats seemed to touch. Large groups of curious spectators gathered on the outskirts of the crowd. The rest of Manchester was like a ghost town. The streets and shops were empty.